Welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. Hey, we just recently read a fascinating book, Energy Crises, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Hard Choices in the 1970s by author Jay Hakes. And we invited him onto the show today to talk about it because we're stuck in the 1970s in the way we think about oil and gas. And it's time for us to turn the page, but we have to look at that history clearly and carefully to make that decision as a country. Jay served as the Department of Energy's chief energy analyst during the Clinton years. And later as a presidential historian, he was the director of the Carter Presidential Library in Atlanta for 13 years. Today, he's an author based in New Orleans. His previous books include A Declaration of Energy Independence, How Freedom from Foreign Oil Can Improve National Security, Our Economy, and the Environment. That book, which he wrote 12 years ago, made the case that America had ignored both the threat of climate change and the challenge of weaning itself from foreign oil for decades, as well as from domestic oil. Jay, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm doing fine. Good to talk to you.
It's a pleasure to have you here, and your book is fascinating. I really enjoyed reading it. First, can you tell us how the 1970s, from Nixon's economic policies to Carter's sort of energy-centric national security policies, continue to shape our views on energy today?
Well, almost everything that we're dealing with today, somehow or other, we were dealing with in the 1970s, which is why it's such a fascinating decade. From the environmental standpoint, they had in Nixon's first year in office, the Santa Barbara oil spill, which sort of sobered everybody up about the risks of offshore drilling for oil. And in 1970, we passed the Clean Air Act, which is the act that the Supreme Court says authorizes the president to take action on climate change. And it had a lot of interruptions, like oil supplies being cut from the Middle East. And for people who lived through it, there were these long gasoline lines. You could wait for 4 hours. And so it's a pivotal time in our history in so many different ways.
Well, I remember those lines, and I was just about to drive, and I remember thinking, oh no, I won't be able to go out cruising. So I had a very, on the ground view of this, but you were right in the middle of it. Now, one of the ideas that has really clearly emerged from the 70s, and we continue to focus on today, is this notion of energy self-sufficiency. But what does that mean in 2020 at a time when we understand the impact of burning fossil fuels, and the United States has shifted from being a net importer to a net exporter? Is it still a useful concept today?
I think it's an important concept, but not as important as it used to be. Mm-hmm. I argued back 12 years ago that being 60% dependent on foreign oil imports was not a good thing. It wasn't good for the economy. It gives Saudi Arabia too much leverage over us. And, Saudi Arabia right now is back in the news because of the assassination of its critics. So these are all important things. And I've argued that we could get to energy independence by stressing renewables, more efficient vehicles, so that the two could be compatible. But I think the real answer to your question is today we can put much more emphasis on the environment because we have to have some balance. But clearly the environment has grown as a challenge, and the need for energy independence has pretty much been taken care of.
Now, you call out a particular date, October 17, 1973, as a critical moment in U.S. energy history. What happened that day?
Well, I did a lot of digging into our relationships with Saudi Arabia, and many of these documents were classified for years, and they're quite mind-blowing when you read them. So on October 17th, 1973, is the day that the oil embargo began against the United States, and the Arab oil-producing countries slashed their production. And that very morning, President Nixon and Secretary of State Kissinger have a meeting with Middle Eastern diplomats, and they came out of that meeting celebrating because they thought they heard there would be no embargo. And yet that same day, the embargo started. And that's not atypical. That kind of misunderstanding is repeated throughout this period. And so from that day, I'd say before that, energy had never been a front burner issue for the American people. Mm-hmm. After that, because of the gasoline lines that you and I went through, there were times when Americans would tell the pollsters energy was their number one issue.
Now, it looks to me like that was the day that oil was weaponized, both in terms of pricing and restricting access to the supply. Have we over-indexed on oil in all of our policy decisions ever since because they aimed that gun barrel at us?
Yeah, it was actually called the oil weapon by the people that did it and the press discussion. And I think it was important to not have that weapon pointed at us. Mm-hmm. And now it isn't. I think we have a lot more freedom with Saudi Arabia, but to deal with Saudi Arabia. But I do think oil has always been kind of special because it's easily transportable. It's the basis of our transportation system. So the issue is, to me, not whether we like oil or don't like oil. The issue is, what are we going to replace it with?
Right.
And the difference is now we have options. So we don't have to be dependent on oil because technology that's available to us today wasn't there in the 1970s. Today it is.
So do you think that there had not been an oil embargo, a series of them starting in 1973, would we have made faster progress towards alternative energy?
No, I would argue that it actually helped us get to alternative energy in a roundabout way. Two things. One is in 1975, the Congress passed the first auto efficiency regulations, right, which basically aimed to double the efficiency of the automobile. So that was an outcome of the oil embargo, and that path eventually leads you to the electric car. The other thing is that we poured money, particularly under Carter, into energy research in a way that we've never done since. And that was directly a reaction to the oil embargo. Now, the research was spent on a lot of things like coal that from a climate standpoint were not helpful. Mm-hmm. But it also was when we started spending a lot of money on photovoltaic cells. And that is probably the number one game changer today. And so one of the lessons from this is these things started in the 70s, but then they were kind of abandoned in the 80s and the 90s. And only recently have we got back on that bandwagon. If you think, had we stuck with both the mile efficiency standards and the investments in solar on a steady basis over a 40, 50-year period, we would be so much better off today.
Well, and one of the impressions I came away from reading the book with is that Nixon's, and you wrote, this is a quote, constant obsession that a weak economy might damage his re-election prospects, seems to have shaped presidential decision-making ever since. And therefore, cheap energy has become the U.S. fallback to drive economic growth artificially. Is that what stopped the innovations in the 80s and 90s?
It didn't help. Carter actually was willing to bite the bullet and deregulate crude oil prices. So mm-hmm. At least for a while, there was this bump in prices that led to efficiency. And during this period, Europe was putting in gasoline taxes, very large gasoline taxes. And politically, we just couldn't do that in this country. The politicians didn't have the nerve to do it. The voters seemed to not want it. So we got caught in this pickle that we couldn't get out of. And there's what I call the lost years of energy, and it's basically from 1995 when the last updates to the mileage efficiency standards occurred, mm-hmm. till 2007 when the Congress came back in and reinstituted the program. So we basically had from 1985 to 2007 where we did nothing about automobile efficiency, and climate change, because the carbon stays in the atmosphere for over 100 years. When you lose a big time period like that, you can't make up the lost ground.
Sure, and we're feeling that now, clearly, in terms of the extreme weather that we're seeing.
Right.
Now, Carter's policies really focused on controlling consumer and industrial oil and gas prices through a variety of mechanisms. That seems to, again, have made cheap energy the priority. Did that help or hurt our progress?
Well, that's a complicated question to ask, not to ask, but to answer. I'm sorry. Carter actually started the decontrol of natural gas prices, and he also decontrolled crude oil prices. He also funded research in the hydraulic fracturing technology, which today we call fracking, which in later years helped reduce the price of oil and gas. So it's a complicated judgment to make about it. But he declared Sunday in the spring of 1978 and dedicated the Solar Energy Research Institute, which is now the National Renewable Energy Laboratory out in Boulder, Colorado. And he put in a windfall profits tax on the oil industry, and a big chunk of that money went to research on things like solar efficiency. So that period there, we got a big boom, and then in the 90s, we started relying more on Japan and Germany because they were making some investments in solar. And then with Obama's stimulus package, for a few years, we got back in the game and we're making heavy investments. So it's a complicated thing to follow the ups and downs.
Sure.
But in the 70s, they were kind of throwing the kitchen sink at the problem. And some of their ideas were good and some weren't so good.
And Carter himself was a nuclear engineer by training, and so was thinking at a level that a lot of us, or a lot of politicians certainly since, have not. And that's something we need, is a new focus on expertise. Do you see promise in what the Biden administration is doing with the stimulus plan and infrastructure discussion?
Yes. Obviously now the people that are in place are people that place a high priority on climate change and realize that we've lost a lot of time. So sort of the gradualist approach, which I would have favored 20 years ago, isn't going to work anymore. So I'm optimistic. Now, what Biden does through executive orders will have to pass the muster of the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. And it's a pretty conservative court right now, but it does have the precedent of allowing the use of the Clean Air Act to deal with climate problems. With Congress, that's a complicated situation. And I hope that they will not try to solve the whole problem in one piece of legislation. I think it's a little bit like the Affordable Care Act. If you take the different parts of it, people say, well, that's a good idea. And then you put it all together and somehow they get all riled up about it. So I think, we have to approach methane leakage as a problem that needs to be dealt with. Well, maybe we can have a standalone piece of legislation on that. Mm-hmm. And then we need to encourage the electric car. We need to make sure that electric generation is coming from zero carbon sources. And, I'm just diving into Bill Gates' book that's just been out for a couple of days. And he says we need to take a look at concrete because that's where a lot of emissions come from. So there's a lot of pieces to this puzzle. And I don't know if our political system can sort of solve them all in one package, but we need to be addressing all of them as fast as we can.
Yeah, well, I think it's a bipolar political system that makes it difficult to do that because we no longer have a real discussion at the center. Yeah. You mentioned earlier that, and you just a moment ago talked about encouraging renewable energy in EVs. And previously you mentioned that our infrastructure is partially designed not only to use oil, but to distribute oil. And now energy generation, as we move to electrification, needs to be distributed all over the place. So generators nearer to where people use it. Are we facing just a fundamental misalignment in the way that we think about our infrastructure right now?
Yeah, it's another thing that's complicated because it sounds contradictory, but you need distributed generation where the power is generated close to where it's being used. But because wind and solar are intermittent and the sunlight and wind availability varies by section of the country, we also need high-speed transmission lines that cross the country. So it's kind of contradictory, but we need both. And the Texas situation that the poor people there have just gone through illustrates that not enough attention has been paid to what might kind of be nerdy issues, but setting up a grid that works with a variety of sources like wind and solar is not that hard, but you have to say it's important to do, and someone has to do it who understands it. So, this may be part of the infrastructure package that President Biden proposes, is making sure that our grid is available for the new realities of a system that's going to have a lot of wind and solar on it. And I think he may be successful in getting that.
Well, we can hope so. Now, the other thing that occurs to me is you talked about that is we have an infrastructure built around gas stations right now, and we need charging stations. How critical do you see funding from the government to driving that versus private enterprise seeing an opportunity and stepping up and building that infrastructure?
I lean a little bit towards the private enterprise side, just because the government's really not set up to run electric charging stations. And I think that they can do their role by tax incentives. Now, recently, I was encouraged to see that the utilities in the southeastern United States, which included Duke Energy, Southern Company, Entergy, had formed a compact, and including the Florida utilities, to set up charging stations throughout the southeastern United States. And, I live in New Orleans, so that covers me for my driving. I probably, when we can fly, would fly if I was going further than that. So, I'm sure they could do it faster with federal incentives. And then, of course, the automobile makers themselves want to set it up because, Tesla may have a different charging system than General Motors. So I think there'll be plenty of private sector partners out there. They'll all want to set up on the interstate in some way or another. So the federal government may need to adjust its rules for, what's allowed on interstates. But, I think a partnership will work very well.
Yeah, it's interesting because, as I think about the infrastructure for charging, you have to stop for longer. Even when we get to very fast charging, it's still going to be a few minutes longer. And our gas stations are isolated things, and they might actually become shopping centers or places where you stop and dine and do something while your car charges. So there's a lot of opportunity there. But
now you're talking, because I live in New Orleans, and it seems to me that the ideal thing is to have a nice restaurant where the charging station is, and I'll be very happy.
Well, and so what kind of incentives would you put in place? Would it be incentives for purchasing an EV, or would you put incentives in place as well for building that kind of a destination, charging destination?
I think you need both. We have an incentive for new electric vehicles, but it's kind of a little bit misguided, because when a company gets up to a certain level, they lose it. And I think maybe it could be lowered a little bit, and they could have it apply to more cars. And then I don't think it would take a heavy tax subsidy for the charging stations, but you could say maybe the government will reimburse you for 1/3 of the cost of your charging station. And neither one of these would need to be permanent. I think in 7 years, maybe the electric cars will be fully cost competitive, and charging stations will be, part of the mix, and so the subsidy can probably be reduced. But at this point, a lot of what we're looking at is speeding up things that might happen anyway, but we can't wait for them to happen at a gradual pace. They have the pace of change has to be accelerated.
So let me ask if you could just, to close our discussion, which has been fascinating. What lessons from the 1970s do you want today's policymakers to keep in mind as we accelerate that transition? And do you feel like the 50-year oil obsession and the 40-year impasse that we've experienced with Islam, that was essentially crystallized by the Iranian Revolution are still driving our policy, or are we ready to move forward?
Well, I think that we can change our view towards the Middle East, and I think maybe we are. I think the new administration may be willing to stand up against Saudi Arabia more than they would have when we had the total obsession in oil. So I think that things are in the process of changing. And I would say that the lesson from the 70s is you've got to keep your foot on the pedal. You can pass, wonderful ideas and do them for a couple of years, and then people get apathetic about it, and they move on to something else, and then we lose the progress that we made. So I think with climate change, we have to think of this is that every year we have to update our level of technology, and we can't have like a 5-year period where we don't do that. Right. And we also have to make sure that we front load a lot of the savings, because if we wait to 2050, we will have put all this carbon up there that'll stay for a long time. So I think the lesson we learned from the 70s was the good ideas they had got lost in the 80s, and it's taken us a very long time to get back to what we should be doing.
Well, so many things got lost in the 80s. Well, Jay, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Really enjoyed it.
Hey, thank you. That was Jay Hakes, folks. He's the author of Energy Crises, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and the Hard Choices in the 1970s. And of course, we'll have a link in the article that goes with this podcast. And we'll be back, hopefully, to talk with Jay again in the future. This is Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, and we'll be back. In the meantime, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of the planet.